So with all that being said, there are actually 4 things that you need to know about your audience before you try to sell an idea to them or try to persuade them. And the 4 things, by the way, these are things that a lot of salespeople know, and but a lot of us that maybe are outside of sales but doing persuasive presentations, they don't necessarily come as natural. So you'll kind of see an overlap. If you have a sales background, you'll start to see some of these things and go, oh God, that totally makes sense. If you don't have a sales background, then this could be some really great information to help you design your presentations in a way that makes them more persuasive. Basically, the concept of know your audience, like we talked about before, can be very confusing. When a lot of presenters hear this, they think of it in context of what not to say versus of presentation design. For instance, I shouldn't tell an off-color joke in church, right? So you got to know your audience. So, and this is, it's another alteration that we might make would be say something like, say I'm speaking to a very technical audience. So if I'm speaking to a very technical audience, I need to cover lots of details because that's what they really love. Or this audience of executive just wants the overview. They don't want any detail. All of these alterations, although possibly valid, are pretty superficial, and they really miss the point of the full concept of knowing your audience. Basically, to really know your audience, there are really 4 things that you really need to uncover in order to be able to design the presentation specifically for those needs. So the first thing is you got to know what the primary problem is that your audience is trying to solve. That's going to be really key. We'll kind of talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail, but let me kind of give you the overview first. So next, the second thing is that you want to identify what the non-negotiable items are that your audience requires. There are certain things in this solution that your audience is going to require, and they're non-negotiable. So if they're not there, they're not going to buy into what you're saying. And third, you have to try to identify any additional items that your audience might want, but they're not going to make or break the agreement, right? So these are kind of what we call deal sweeteners. These are things that if they're there, then people go, oh, okay, great. Well, that's even better than what I thought it was going to be. And then finally, this is the last one and really the most critical one. This is the one we're going to end on today, is you got to find out the emotional motive that would cause your audience to take action or to agree with you. So once you get to that point, your presentation is going to be very, very persuasive. So when you start designing a presentation, we often don't, we haven't really thought through the answers to all of these questions. So often we have to alter and then adjust on the fly as we discover more about our audience. So, a lot of times when we start to design the presentation, we're working off of limited information. We're not going to have the answer to every single question. And so we have to kind of guess a little bit. But as we start to uncover details about the true wants and needs of our audience, then we can make it a little bit more credible, a little bit more applicable to what they want. But if you ask the right questions to the right people ahead of time, you're going to have fewer of these adjustments, by the way. So basically doing a little bit of research up front about who your audience is can actually make it to where you have to make fewer of those adjustments along the way. So let's talk about that very first thing that I talked about. First, you have to know the primary problem that your audience is trying to solve. So I remember my very first sales course that I ever attended, the instructor started the class by saying, by the way, I've heard this a lot, so I don't think he actually made this up, but it's one of those things that gets repeated over and over again in sales training, but it's still kind of funny and pretty applicable even today. He said, last year, 1 million quarter-inch drill bits were sold. None of the people who bought those drill bits wanted a quarter-inch drill bit, by the way. And then he paused dramatically, and then he finished up by saying, what all those people wanted was a quarter-inch hole. And at the time, I remember thinking, well, what the heck is the difference? Because being new to sales and being new to presenting at the time, I didn't really comprehend what he was trying to get across. It was a good analogy, but it didn't really tie it into reality much. And it wasn't until like much, much, much later that I really understood the brilliance of that concept that he was trying to teach. Most people, by the way, all people probably, are pretty self-centered. We think about ourselves. We are way more concerned about our own personal problems than your problems. That's what most people do, right? So for instance, let's say that Software engineer gives a report about a software update. Well, that engineer can meticulously go through every single item that her team updated in this new release, the new software release. However, if she did that, she'd just be talking about the drill bit, right? The audience, that person that's setting in the audience anyway would be thinking, I don't really care about your stupid drill bit, or I don't really care about your stupid update. What the heck does that have to do with me, right? On the other hand, if the engineer first thought about the problems that her specific audience was experiencing, the presentation becomes more interesting. So the engineering team didn't just pick random items to update. They chose items that were causing problems for the people in the audience, the people that were actually using the software. For example, the old software layout, she could say something like, the old software layout caused you to have to re-enter data in multiple places. Well, this update does that for you, which saves you time, right? So this version, that second phrase that she would have said, the one that I just kind of mentioned, that shows the hole. It shows the 1/4-inch hole. It doesn't show the drill bit. It's not the update isn't what's important. It's what that update will do. So that's really one of the more important things to kind of keep in mind, is that every single person in your audience has a specific problem that your solution or your concept may help them avoid or fix. And if you can kind of show them that your solution fixes the problem that they have, they'll be on board. So that's number one. That's the first step, is you got to figure out what the problem is that the people in the audience are facing and show how your information will help them solve that problem. So the second piece of information that you need to know about your audience is that you want to identify what we call the non-negotiable items. That those are the things that your audience is going to require from your solution. And anytime, by the way, this is true of anything that you buy, but anytime a person buys something, it could be an item, a service, an idea, if you're trying to persuade somebody, that anytime somebody buys any of those things, that person creates a list of non-negotiable items in his or her head. Sometimes they might write it out, but that's really rare. Most of the time it's kind of in our head where we say, it's got to be this, it's got to be this, and it's got to be this. If it's not those three things, I don't even care. Don't even bother showing it to me, right? So these are the things that the buyer requires from the item, the service, or the idea. If any of those things are not present, the buyer is not going to purchase that thing. They're not going to agree with the presenter. So sometimes they like I said, they create that written list. Most often, though, the person will not take a lot of mental effort to clarify that list. They don't even think about it. They don't have that mental checklist kind of written out or created thoroughly. So a good salesperson, a good presenter, can really help the people in his or her audience create that list based on the presentation or during the presentation. For instance, let's say that a family wants new living room furniture. I mean, something totally unrelated to presenting or presentations. Let's just say something really simple, like we need new living room furniture. Now, that family's primary problem might just be something simple as the current furniture is dated. So they want to get something new, right? That's basically the reason they go into a furniture store. If they create no additional buying criteria, though, then that process of finding the perfect furniture is going to be pretty difficult. They'll have an enormous number of choices. So maybe a good first step might be that they start by measuring the space, right? They may also look at the current color scheme of the living room. So they want to kind of match the current scheme so they don't have to replace everything in the living room. So in addition, they may decide that the current furniture has it's focused around the TV, and mom wants the family to do projects together instead. Nobody really watches the TV anymore. So she wants to make the center table the focus. So basically what's happening is, as they kind of think about it, or sometimes if the salesperson at the furniture store asks additional questions, you may be able to get the family to kind of clarify what their criteria are. So all of these items, once they're identified, become non-negotiable. So like, for instance, if the furniture is too big, we can't buy it. If the furniture must fit our current color scheme. It must fit the space that we have. We don't want to have to replace the carpet or the rug or something like that. So the point is that most people walk into a furniture store having not physically created a list ahead of time. And usually questions from the salesperson helps that family clarify these things. And you want to play the same role with your audience. Basically, what you can do is during your presentation, you're bringing up things that prompt questions in the mind of the people in the audience in order to kind of help them determine what this criteria is. And when you do that, you're going to have a much more interactive and a much more impactful presentation for the people that are in your audience. So let me give you a case study about how a presentation team got to know the audience better, really, than the audience even knew themselves. Years ago, I was helping a team create a presentation to a school board. The school board was building a new high school in the school district. And before this team brought me in to help them, they organized their entire presentation around themselves. They talked about their years of experience and how qualified their team was and how many high schools that they had built. And they created a pretty good presentation, but it was really presenter focused versus audience focused. It really wasn't helping that school board solve any problems that were important to them. It was really all about the presenters. It was all about the company. So I asked them, I asked this team a really simple question. I said, what do the members of this school board really want? And the answer I got was a new high school, right? Which is, if you go back to the example, that's the drill bit. The drill bit. I ask clarifying questions though, because it's really not about the drill bit. It's about the whole, right? So why do they need a new school? So I asked that clarifying question. And once I asked that, they had to think for a second. And then one of the team members kind of responded with, well, the current school is overcrowded, right? So now we've got the whole. That's the quarter-inch hole now. That's the primary problem. The current high school is overcrowded. So once we uncover that true problem, then identifying the buying criteria got a little easier. Once you identify what that problem is, it becomes easier to kind of uncover what is going to be their primary criteria for that purchase. So I asked the group for their thoughts on what that criteria of the board might be. What things might they use to make the decision on who they give this project to. And the criteria number one, the very first thing, was absolutely unanimous. It was like when I asked that question, every one of them kind of answered at the same time. They all said price. And the reason why is because the city floated a bond for this specific project for a specific amount. And if the price of the new building exceeded that bond amount, then they couldn't buy it. That's a non-negotiable, right? So a major portion of the team, by the way, agreed that the second non-negotiable was the schedule, because if they couldn't finish building the high school by the 1st of August, then the district would lose an entire school year of use, because that's when the school year starts. So if they couldn't have the building completed by the start of that next school year, then that was pretty bad. And so schedule was going to be pretty important to them. Then the team kind of continued to add items that included things like safety and maintenance costs and environmental issues. But keep in mind that they created the entire list without any input from the school board. They were just guessing. So to verify the items, they sent the list to their contact with the district, and then they just asked the contact to rank the list of items in the order of importance. It worked like a charm. They basically the contact kind of came back, and the top two things were number one and number two, but the order of the remaining items were a little bit different than what they expected, and so they focused on the things that were most important. So you can kind of do the same thing in your presentations. Once you identify what the primary problem is, you can say, okay, just based on what I know about this audience, what would be their criteria? What are the things that they're going to be most important to these folks? And sometimes it's going to be a guess, but if you are able to kind of go back to at least segments of that audience and kind of ask them ahead of time, sometimes they can help you clarify the content that you cover in that presentation. So the third thing that you want to try to do is identify any additional items that the audience may want, but whether they're there or not won't make or break the agreement. They're not going to agree with you just because you have that. But if you do have this in there, it might be a nice kind of what I call deal sweeteners. So the audience may want certain things that aren't really a requirement. However, if the solution contains a few of these things, all the better, right? Salespeople call these things, like I said before, they're deal sweeteners. For instance, when you buy a car, your non-negotiables might be dependability, gas mileage, price, et cetera, things like that. However, if you get all of those things and the car also has Apple CarPlay, power windows, power seats, it makes your decision a whole lot easier, right? Because you're getting bonus things. These are things that you didn't really require, but if they're there, I'll take your car over a different car. So when people, by the way, when folks, this is just internally at our company, when people register for one of our classes, we offer them like 3 30-minute one-on-one coaching sessions with their instructor as well. They get that for free. It doesn't cost anything. So it's kind of a bonus that we give to folks. The class member didn't expect to have these one-on-one sessions with the instructor, but since they're offered, it takes a lot of the risk away from the buying decision. So it's one of those things that not many of our competitors do. I don't know of any of our competitors that do that, but because we offer it, if somebody is kind of comparing us to somebody else that does public speaking classes, a lot of times they'll choose us just because of that additional deal sweetener that's in there. So when you design your presentations, you want to try to anticipate buying criteria that the audience may not be aware of, and then add some of those items into your presentation as well. So going back to the software update example that I told earlier, something like, hey, by the way, we added something else in that's kind of cool. Now when you log in, the software automatically pulls up the project that you were last working on. So you don't have to do any searching for it, that kind of thing. So again, it's not a deal maker or a deal breaker, but if it's there, if it makes their job easier, then that's kind of a cool thing. So the last item, the fourth item, this is the thing that we're going to spend a little bit more time on. It's one that's more difficult to anticipate or uncover, but once you do, it makes the persuasion process much, much, much easier. So number 4 is you want to find out the emotional motive that the person has, the people in the audience have, that would cause them to take action. What is the emotional motive? So the audience always, audiences always have 2 reasons why they agree with someone or buy something from somebody. And the first of those 2 things is that it's got to make logical sense. If it doesn't make logical sense, good luck, right? It's going to be very difficult. The second reason, though, is more emotional. You will actually deliver a more persuasive speech if you uncover this emotional reason up front. For instance, if we go back to the software example, reducing double entry of data also reduces human error, right? So that's one of the things that the software update was trying to do, is reduce that double entry. And as a result, that will reduce human error. Well, one data entry person may have been reprimanded for human error, for errors, repeated errors, and so might have been reprimanded. Another person might be detail oriented, but maybe slower on the data entry. So the update allows each of those 2 people to be more efficient as a result and more promotable, right? So the emotional motive can be difficult to anticipate. So let's kind of spend a little bit more time on this, because the emotional motive for each of those 2 people are a little bit different, right? One is, hey, if that person has already been reprimanded, then the solution will cause that person to have more job security, right? And if and for the second person that is able to be more efficient, now that software update can help that person be more promotable, because now they're accomplishing more in a lesser time. So know your audience basically by anticipating what the possible emotional motive might be.